Good evening, everyone. Welcome to the Empire New York District's Membership Monday event that is focusing on diversity, equity, and inclusion. My name is Melissa Ward. I am the Rotary Coordinator for Zone 32, which I guess in layman's terms means that I'm the membership chair for a little corner of the Northeast United States. In 2019, Rotary International adapted the following statement. As a global network that strives to build a world where people unite and take action to create lasting change, Rotary values diversity and celebrates the contributions of people of all backgrounds, regardless of their age, ethnicity, race, color, abilities, religion, socioeconomic status, culture, sex, sexual orientation, or gender identity. Rotary will cultivate a diverse, equitable, and inclusive culture in which people from underrepresented groups have greater opportunities to participate as members and leaders. Tonight, you will hear from several members from our region who will share their experiences in Rotary and in their corner of the United States. What better day to celebrate our uniqueness and our oneness than on Dr. Martin Luther King's birthday? Dr. King reminds us that everyone has the power for greatness, not for fame, but greatness because greatness is determined by service. Today, more than ever, the world needs your greatness in the service that you do through Rotary. Dr. King also reminds us that it will be power infused with love and justice that will change dark yesterdays into bright tomorrows and lift us from the fatigue of despair to the buoyancy of hope. A message that we need to reiterate as we grow Rotary to lift the buoyancy of hope throughout the world. Your host tonight is none other than Assistant Rotary Coordinator Scott McDonnell, who will introduce our panels and experts. Scott, I turn it over to you.
Thank you, Melissa. I'd like to start our multi-district DEI Membership Monday seminar this evening. And for those of you that this is your first time, we have 4 districts represented, really much of upstate New York. Rochester, Finger Lakes, Binghamton, Syracuse, Albany areas are all with us. And we have well over 300 people registered. So a fantastic response for this very, very timely seminar. And I'd like to start, as I said, with a statement of purpose for the seminar, the reason we're doing it. Rotary International has communicated the importance of addressing matters of diversity, equity, and inclusion, as Melissa just pointed out. As an organization, districts and clubs are working to support this initiative via the creation of new efforts as we head into the 2021 calendar year. Our panel tonight will discuss diversity, equity, and inclusion, and how clubs can work collaboratively to support this charge. And I'd like to now introduce the panel. And as I do that, I wonder if the panelists could give a wave so people can ID you. We have a lot of pages of people here, and therefore it might be best if the attendees could put it on speaker view, so you don't have to search for who's speaking. It'll just pop up. It'll be a lot easier that way, and you'll know who is speaking right off the bat. Our first panelist tonight is joining us is Kate Sims. She is the Assistant Rotary Coordinator for Zone 32, a past Rotary District 7890 Governor, and a member of the Manchester, Connecticut Rotary Club. Thanks, Kate, for being with us. Second panelist is Devin White, CFP, registered PCA at Janie Montgomery Scott LLC, Eastwood, New York Rotary Club. That's Syracuse area, I believe. Drake Harrison is our third, retired director of Onondaga Community College's Collegiate Science and Technology Entry Program, president of the 100 Black Men of Syracuse, and also a member of the Eastwood, New York Rotary Club. Our fourth is Dr. Rodman King, SUNY Oswego, that's my alma mater, by the way, SUNY Oswego's Chief Diversity and Inclusion Officer, and a member of the Oswego, New York Rotary Club. We have also Denise Denoto, Communications and Outreach Specialist, Consumer Directed Choices, Albany, New York, member of the Colony Guilderland, New York Rotary Club. And our sixth panelist, Corrine V. Zitunzian. She's an attorney with Harris Beach PLLC and a member of the Fairport, New York Rotary Club. Thank you all so very much for joining us this evening. We asked attendees to enter any questions or comments that you have during the course of the evening for the panelists in the chat feature, and we'll monitor and endeavor to address as many as we can. Now I'd like to introduce our moderator, is Dr. Sim Covington Jr., Chief Diversity Officer of the Finger Lakes Community College, right in our backyard here in District 7120, and a member of the Canandaigua, New York Rotary Club. Thank you, Dr. Covington, for being with us this evening as well. And now I turn the program over to you, sir.
Good evening, everyone. Once again, my name is Dr. Sim Covington. I currently serve as the Chief Diversity Officer here at Finger Lakes Community College, and I am very humbled to be here. Sitting in this role, I want to take the time to give some acknowledgement. So I want to make sure that I take the time to acknowledge Scott, who introduced me, Linda Cole, who is our district governor. I want to make sure that I also acknowledge Karen Parkhurst, Lynn Holcomb, who's the president of my club in Canandaigua. And I also want to make sure that I give a huge shout out to the Utica Rotary Club, which is where I was initiated into Rotary. I'm very humbled to serve currently as the chair for the District 7120 Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion Committee. And I look forward to tonight's discussion. I'm going to read my script, and then we're going to go ahead and get right to our great panelists. As Rotary International has communicated the importance of addressing diversity, equity, and inclusion as an organization, districts and clubs are working to support this initiative via the creation of new efforts as we head into the 2021 calendar year. Our panel will discuss diversity, equity, and inclusion and how clubs can work collaboratively to support this change. I'm going to be asking our panelists primarily two questions, starting with them sharing their story, and then I have a follow-up question. So we're going to actually go in the following order. Rodman, I'm going to start with you if you don't mind. And I want to give a shout out to Rodman because Rodman and I are coming full circle. Last year, we were humbled to have him come to Finger Lakes Community College as our keynote for Martin Luther King Day. And I have the pleasure of working with him again. And I always learn from Rodman, excuse me, as well. So Rodman, if you can please take this time to share how your social identity, for those of you who are not familiar with social identity, we're referring to race, gender identity, age, religion, any aspects of somebody's social identity. So for those of you who are not familiar with that terminology. So Rodman, can you please share how your social identity has impacted your lived experience in America?
And I want to thank my colleague Sim. My youngest son is a first-year student at Finger Lakes Community College. And I told him he could go there not merely because it's a good, excellent educational institution, but if I needed to check on him, I could call Sim, and Sim would get in his business, and I would find out what he is up to as a young 18-year-old man in college. Of course, the pandemic is keeping young people on the straight and narrow. Let's get directly into it. Race is one of the most predominant parts of my social identity. And I want to make a quick distinction between race and ethnicity. By race, we're talking, and I'm talking very simple terms. I'm not going to get in very technical academic language, but the sort of physical traits, my skin color, okay? Other sort of things like that is when we're talking about race. Versus ethnicity, where we're talking about culture or other things like this. From an ethnic perspective, I identify as Afro-Caribbean. My father is originally from Cat Island in the Bahamas, but race is one of the first things that I think people notice about me. It is a thing that shapes their interactions with me, both immediately and over time. It has been something that I've had to be aware of in my professional career, in my life, just as a person living in communities. So it is one of those things that I'm mindful of, not just because people identify me that way, but because of the salience in my life. I've had to figure out over time how I want to think about my racial identity as opposed to having those things imposed upon me by other people. Sim has made a mistake. My sister said I should always speak last because as the youngest in the family, I don't know how to be quiet, but I will try my best to discipline myself and respect the time. So there's so much that can be said, and I'll share just a little bit about how my racial identity has affected my experience as a person, who's lived in a variety of places, but most of my life in upstate in central New York. From an early age, preschool was the first time I was called the N-word. And that's the first time that I was exposed to the concept of race. My family was the second Black family to move into my neighborhood in Rochester, New York. And one of our neighbors, I was just a kid playing with Tonka trucks in the yard, had some words to me and used that slur. And I didn't even understand what the word meant. Throughout my life, there have been people who, out of hate and out of ignorance, have made assumptions about me or judgments about me because of my race. We are not born hateful people. I do not believe that. But we are educated and habituated into racial bias and things like that. If I can jump ahead in my life, it has also shaped my professional existence. As a younger version of myself, less gray, I was thinking about graduate school. I have a PhD in philosophy, and I went to talk to someone about, doing graduate study, and they told me I should maybe go into political science or into sociology. And I wondered why. Well, there's just not a lot of Black people in philosophy. Well, shouldn't that be a judgment that I make? I remember as a young academic, I started my career as a philosopher, and actually not as a member of professional staff or things like that, but as a professor teaching. I went to my first major academic conference in Atlanta, Georgia. I was excited. At a paper, it was an international conference. My paper got accepted. I was so excited to go to this conference. And I'm in the conference dinner. It's pre-dinner and everyone gets together and everything else like this. And I'm there. I'm in my conference suit. And one of the conference organizers comes to me, and I know he's a conference organizer because he had a badge that said conference organizer, and he came up to me and asked me to get more coffee. And I said, I'm actually a presenter at the conference. I'm an attendee. I'm doing the session tomorrow morning. The assumption was that I was there as a person to serve the coffee or part of the wait staff at the event, not an attendee. And even as I transitioned into the sort of staff and professional side, administrative side of higher education, there are people who would make assumptions about my race, about my professional status. I would often do admissions events and things like this, and people would come up to me, parents, meeting and things like that, not knowing, would say to me, how's your basketball team? I was like, I think they're okay, but I wouldn't know because I'm not the coach. The real challenge that my racial identity has presented for me are the assumptions that people make. And it's a constant struggle to push back against the assumptions that people make, the subconscious and conscious beliefs that they hold about my racial identity, for them to actually see me, the person. So that has been a challenge throughout my life, and I've got some more to say, Sim, but I want to watch my time here. I know we got a follow-up question, so maybe we should go to the follow-up first, and if I have time after that, I can say another word or two. And we have a wonderful panel. I want to make sure that folks can share their experiences as well.
Absolutely. So the specific follow-up question that I have for you is, for those people who may not be familiar, can you please actually explain the difference between diversity, equity, and inclusion?
Yeah. So a lot has been written about this. I mean, if you just do a random old search on Google or something else, you get all kinds of stuff. Some of it not very accurate, so be careful. But let's just take it in its simplest sort of form. Diversity has to do, in its simplest form, with a range of human difference, right? The ways in which people can be present in the world, okay? And a very simple definition of it, right? So, race is a differentiating factor, things like that. Now, many definitions don't leave it just at demographics or at these differences, because there's a difference between being Black and being left-handed. There's a difference between being lesbian, bi, gay, or queer and being over 6 feet tall. Some differentiating factors do not form the durable social identities that Sim was talking about, or have the histories. So when we're talking about a diversity, we're not just talking about any old kind of difference usually, we're talking about social identity groups, these sort of salient ways that people identify themselves and form their identity of who they are, okay? So inclusion is about having a seat at the table. Maybe it's the simplest way to put it. In active ways, it's about creating a culture of belonging. Do people feel like they belong? Do they feel like their voices are going to be heard, right? Do they feel like people are interested in their perspective or their needs, okay? And you can see how these things are complementary. Just having a lot of different people together doesn't get you a loving community. Inclusion helps bring that together, right? So now you actively seek out and want to produce a culture of belonging, okay? Equity has to do, in its simplest sense, fairness, right? But also equality of access to the goods and opportunities of a community, okay? It's one thing to have a seat at the table. It's another thing to have an equal voice in the process, okay? So those three values together see the beauty of the different ways that people can be present in the world and their social identities, calls on us to actively create a culture of belonging, and to guarantee that in our practices and the way that our communities function, that people have an equal and fair chance, that barriers to their accessing goods and opportunities are removed. All of these things are active concepts, not passive.
Rodman, thank you very much. The next person who I'm going to politely ask to contribute at this time is going to be Kate. So Kate, I'm going to go right back to the first question that I asked Rodman. And can you please share how your social identity has impacted your lived experience in America?
Absolutely. And good evening, everyone. Thank you for having me. So I have a similar story, Rodman. I am also the youngest of my family. I'm the baby of 11. And I have been often asked to stop talking as well. I always share with them that they never gave me enough time, so I'm taking what I can get now. So I will try to be brief as well. So I was born the youngest of 11, Irish family. We were born in Long Island, New York, and we were raised on the Great South Bay. And when I say on the Great South Bay, we had a home on the Great South Bay. But you'll often hear me when I grew up saying that I was poor. I had 11 brothers and sisters, and we had a 7-bedroom, 4-bath house. I wasn't poor, rather privileged, but I didn't know it at that time, right? I grew up and I had a good life and still do, continue to have a great life. My identity, however, is the past 27 years married to my husband, who is a man of color. He's African-American. We have 4 biracial children together. And so when I'm alone, and I'm out in the world, I'm treated differently than I'm with my husband and or my children, who I'm looked at differently. And so I have, quite honestly, I look at it sometimes as a dual life, if you will. Internally, I don't believe that. Internally, I don't live that. But externally, out in the world, I'm treated like that. I can share with you a few stories from a white woman. And when we went through all of this social unrestness, I had a good friend say to me one day, "Hey, Kate, how do you feel about everything? You're raising children of color and you have a son of color." And my answer was, thanks for asking. I'm not accustomed to being asked that question. I'm not accustomed to being asked that question because I'm not a woman of color. But I am a woman of color. I am a woman raising a son of color. So what does that mean? When my son was 2 months old, I dropped him off at the daycare of a healthcare that I worked in, Sarasota Memorial down in Sarasota, Florida. Work in healthcare, so you assume everybody's there for the right reasons. I went to pick my son up 8 hours later, and I was told that my son wasn't at the daycare. The woman who received my son when I dropped him off did not like children of color or people of color. She put my son in the corner of the institution and no one knew he was there for the entire 8 hours. As you can imagine, it wasn't a good scene. I didn't fight the company. I asked for one thing only: that her license to be taking care of any children were taken away. That no mother of any color would ever face what she did to our family that day. Last year, my son called as he was visiting his girlfriend in college. The police stopped them. My son called me, and my words were, "Son, put me on speaker, don't say a word, keep your hands visible." Those stories are true. When you hear people of color tell those stories, they're true. They're accurate. We need to listen. We as the white race, need to listen. I think for me, it really hit home when this year my son wrote an article and he acknowledged that he didn't have the same life. He didn't sit at the dinner table and chat about, all the what's going on in the world. What we chatted about was how to keep safe if you're pulled over, what it's like to be a man of color. We didn't have as serious conversations with our girls, but we certainly had that one with our son. And I think that in looking the reflection, that's what hit me most this past summer, was his reflection. And as much as I thought I did what I could to raise the kids in the best of both worlds, they still feel what society delivers them. So that basically, again, I'm going to be very mindful of the time. I know that we have 4 more speakers, but that's basically a little purview from what it feels like, and what it feels like for us as we attend Rotary meetings. When my husband says, "You know what, I'm just going to head back up to the room," when people are not necessarily social to him. Thank you.
So this is first and foremost, thank you. I'm getting a little bit of feedback, so I don't know if you need to mute, Kate.
I can hear you. Okay.
Can you hear me? Yes?
Yeah, I can hear you.
Well, first and foremost, I would like to say thank you very much for your contribution. I want to say something very quickly before I ask you the follow-up question. And what I would like to say is relevant to what Rodman shared around diversity, equity, and inclusion. I do want to reiterate that there is another term out there called co-optation. And co-optation is what's considered selective leadership practices when organizations intentionally bring in diversity to deflect from racist practice within the organization. So it's also, in layman's term, it's referred to as tokenism, right? So that's not what we're looking to do in Rotary. We're actually looking to bring in real inclusion. Karen, in regards to your contribution, one of the things that I say is, I've said since I've been the Chief Diversity Officer here at Finger Lakes Community College, which you can attest to, especially given your story, is the following. Diversity, equity, inclusion becomes real when it becomes personal. You have a lot of people who are out here in the community giving a lot of rhetoric, right? But they don't really understand or genuinely support aspects of diversity, equity, inclusion. Specifically within higher education, we have to deal with what I could categorize as intellectual sparring. So people who may feel the need because of their privilege to challenge. And I always like to move from theory to practice. So I always tell my colleagues, if you are questioning anything that I'm saying to you around diversity, equity, inclusion, let's stop talking about it and let's live it. I challenge any of you to walk with me in this community while holding my hand, and let's see if the experience that you have with me is the experience that you have independent of me. If that's not the case, then, clearly I've proven my point. Something else that I want to reiterate is no one's taken me up on my offer, right? Which reinforces for me that you have the luxury of knowing that it exists, but not living in it, right? So that reinforces what we're really having a conversation around diversity, equity, inclusion. So Kate, thank you very much. So the follow-up question that I do have for you is, why should diversity, equity, inclusion be important to Rotary Club?
If Rotary does not embrace diversity, equity, and inclusion, we'll look exactly like we do today, and we'll continue to lose membership as we don't reflect the communities in which we live in. We as Rotarians need to gain awareness and understanding of the people we serve. We need to incorporate clubs that reflect our communities, ones that incorporate the interests and attitudes of others, ones that have a true understanding of these needs of our communities and not just scratching the surface for recognition or pat on the back. We need to engage in conversation, engage in understanding, engage in awareness of others that look different from us, others that have a different perspective, others that don't have the resources we have. We need to not just open our doors of opportunity, but our hearts to be a little bit vulnerable, a little bit uncomfortable. We need to understand our own personal biases and learn to course correct in order to be inclusive. In 1987, women were officially allowed in Rotary. 32 years later, we're welcoming our first woman president. And as Melissa noted, in 2019, Rotary International adopted the commitment to diversity, equity, inclusion. We simply don't have 32 years to wait to deal with diversity, equity, and inclusion. Our membership will continue to suffer.
So I am going to do something very quickly. The first thing that I'm going to do before we move to our next panelist is give a shout out to a colleague by the name of Joanne Longo from Utica, New York. I want to make sure that I take the time to acknowledge both her and her husband, because I had the opportunity to serve with them at the Players of Utica in Utica, New York. So I'm saying one hello, but I'm saying this to reiterate the importance of making connections, which embodies diversity, equity, inclusion. So I want to make sure that I take the time to acknowledge her and her husband. The next person who we have here is an individual by the name of Devin. And Devin, can you please share how your social identity has impacted your lived experience in America?
Absolutely. Can you all hear me okay?
Yes, we can.
Okay, I'm working off of my phone here, so that's wonderful. The segue was perfect from Kate's story to mine and your interjection, which is most of my life has been defined by that term, tokenism. So briefly about me, I am 28 years old. I was raised here in Syracuse, New York, part of the Eastwood Rotary. And for most of my childhood, I grew up with people who lived like me and looked like me. I was poor. I grew up on the south side of Syracuse, one of the most impoverished areas in the US. And my parents were fortunate and lucky enough to put me in a Catholic high school, middle and high school. So it started at age started at 7th grade was really when I had a significant turnaround experience in terms of cultural diversity. Living and growing up through Bishop Blood in high school, my experience changed from everyone looking like me to being one of the few who look like me. And I had two groups of friends where one of those groups, I was the token Black guy. And although, those are still very close friends to this day, the dynamic of that relationship, of those relationships, were always much different than the relationships with my Black friends. And that is that I always felt like there was a level of shallowness in our friendship. There were certain subjects that would always get skated across, never addressed. You listen to rap music and, you know, the N-word comes around and all of them look at me, and, you know, it's one of those things where, no, we're not going to say it, but it's that feeling. So what has defined me is being in those situations so much that I was able to navigate those waters and feel comfortable being that token Black person, which quite honestly made it easier for me to be brought into Rotary. I mean, when we showed up at Eastwood, I was the only person of color. And we'll hear from another gentleman who I work with and is now another person of color in our Rotary. But the challenge that we always face, I think, is that it's intimidating to be the trailblazer in these situations. And I would say that majority of my life, I juggled from being a trailblazer and walking on eggshells. I too live in a profession where, as a financial advisor and financial planner, there aren't many Black people in the industry. There aren't many people who look like me. So I had to consciously adapt what I looked like, how I spoke, and who I was to feel as though I belonged, and both at my office, in that environment, and most importantly, you know, in that field. And so one of the reasons why I'm so passionate and so moved to become a leader and to push forward this effort is because not everyone is going to see the world as I did, and take that step knowing that there's no other person around you who looks like this. We live in a community that is one of the most diverse in the country, and yet our Rotary does not reflect that, our Rotary membership. And you know, my take and my will is to do what I can to change that. I don't want to speak too long because I want to yield my time to Drake. I think he has some very powerful things to speak about as far as action items and steps that we're taking. But I think this is a good time to pivot to that follow-up question. I'll be happy to answer that as well.
Absolutely. How can racially homogenous clubs be intentional about addressing matters of diversity, equity, and inclusion?
So I think the biggest thing is about meeting people where they are and going where you aren't already. So you know, one of the things that I'm focused on as being the president-elect for Eastwood Rotary is trying to cultivate opportunities and events where we you know, can mingle with people of color who don't look like the traditional membership. And it's that point of personal that you mentioned. When we surround ourselves with people who don't look like us, genuinely and repeatedly, you will find that those people are also human, and you will find that you might love that person and have a sense of respect, and that, I think, in itself will bring us closer. There are a lot of people who mingle within their own community, their own comfort zone. And I think that's the first step in changing it. We have to come outside of our comfort zone and meet people where they are, not necessarily where you are, in order to make lasting and effective change.
He was on the board of players.
Thank you very much. Denise, do you mind muting everyone again? I'm getting a little bit of feedback. I apologize. Okay, thank you very much. I'm going to very quickly share. I'm just going in and out as the moderator and share my positive experience because I see a Rotarian from my club by the name of Janet. So let me go ahead and give Janet a shout out. So once again, my name is Sim Covington. I'm originally from New York City. I moved upstate for the beginning of my undergraduate and graduate education. So when I stepped into Canandaigua Rotary Club, I was the only person of color in the room at the time. And if I would have operated based off of implicit bias or assumptions, right, I may have automatically said to myself, and had it played out in my actions, that I was not going to be welcomed. And it was the furthest thing from the truth. From day one, my experience in the Canandaigua Rotary Club has been very positive. I've made some meaningful relationships through the individuals who are a part of that club. Janet would always come up to me to make me feel welcome. So thank you very much for that, as well as other individuals who were a part of that club. In addition to that, the club invited me to actually facilitate a discussion to let them know things that we were doing at the college around diversity, equity, and inclusion, and they asked very meaningful questions. So I think part of moving the dial forward when it comes to diversity, equity, and inclusion is operating with intentionality. You have to be intentional about moving the dial forward when it comes to diversity, equity, and inclusion. You have to be intentional about getting out of your comfort zone and setting the stage to create welcome for individuals who may be coming in from diverse backgrounds. The next person we're going to go to is Drake. And Drake, once again, the question for you is, can you please share how your social identity has impacted your lived experience in America?
Can everyone hear me? Okay.
Yes.
So after, Dr. King, Devin, and Kate, shared their experience in this area regarding this question, mine may be similar, but a little bit different. So I'm originally not from upstate New York or Syracuse, because that's where I live. And I definitely want to give a shout out to my club, Eastwood Rotary, because I think it is a welcoming club. We have changes, but I think they are open-minded and willing to listen. But my experience, I'm originally from Oakland and Sacramento, California, which helped to shape who I am to this day and my experience. As a young person growing up in Oakland in the 60s, when things started to change and Oakland became the center for social unrest in America. And I was able to experience and see people who folks did not like or despise or thought they were, what we would call reverse racism. So when you talk about Angela Davis, when you talk about Stokely Carmichael, when you talk about H. Rap Brown, I saw all those folks who impacted how I felt and how I was going to deal with racism going forward. But at home, it was unusual. My stepfather was from Baton Rouge, Louisiana, or right outside of that. And so, at that time, in that area, the young people were fairly rebellious. And, there were, as I used to call it, two sides of the coin. There was my parents who believed strongly in the person that we're celebrating today, Martin Luther King, and we did too. But we were, at that time, not turn the other cheek generation. That was not what we believed in. We didn't believe in violence or anything, but we didn't understand why should we deal with that sort of thing. So, with that being said, when the Panthers arose, my mother understood myself and my younger brother. I'm the eldest of 5 children. And one day when we came home, there was a moving van in front of our home. And my mother told us to get in the car. And we didn't quite understand, where are we going? She said, we're moving. And we said, we're moving because we all wanted to stay in the big city. We're all, this is where all the action was. So we moved to Sacramento. at the time, Sacramento had a modest Black population, mostly from the South because of closing Air Force bases in Mobile and Texas. And so I went to junior high school college, of all things, Albert Einstein Junior High School. Albert Einstein Junior High School, there was probably, I'm going to say, 80 Black students in the entire school, right? The transition was tough. For the first 2 years, I had never really gotten in a lot of trouble, but for the first 2 years, I think I was in more fights at Albert Einstein than I had ever been in my life, right? And it was for a number of reasons, but it was a tough adjustment period. I didn't really experience people using the N-word. It was more, and at the time, I didn't know this until later, it was more micro, like where you were, like classes you were placed in and how people saw you, people feeling sorry for you because you're not capable, thinking you're not capable of doing the work at Albert Einstein Junior High. When I went to high school at Hiram Johnson, there was a teacher, white, who saw something in me, and that's when speech and debate and oratorical interpretation and impromptu speaking was huge. So I played on the football team, I ran track, and I was okay. I wasn't a superstar or anything, but I was better at track than I was at football. So she saw something in me and she said, I want you to come to the speech and debate competition. Because I had taken her class, because I was just trying to take a class so I could move on and get out of the school. So I took her up on it and I went to the competition and I became interested. So I went to a competition where I competed. I didn't, obviously I lost because I wasn't that good, but I adopted a speech. I participated and I ended up going to the state finals in oratorical interpretation because of a teacher who believed in me. Then time goes on, I go to college. I started out at UC Davis, and that was around the Bakke era when he sued the University of California Davis Medical School for entrance and affirmative action. So I was there at that time when that took place. So I transferred, ended up graduating from the University of San Francisco, went to work for Southern Pacific, which is where I first experienced my real first racism. Not being called the N-word, but because I was dealing with in an industry where there wasn't a lot of Black people, and most of the Black people held laborer jobs. They didn't hold engineering jobs or hostler jobs or any of the upper level. So one day, once I figured out what was going on, and I got tired of being a laborer and washing engines and that sort of thing, I went to my supervisor and said, can I take the exam to become an engineer, right? He said, well, Drake, you should be happy where you're at. And I said, well, but I saw, and I'll just use a name, John, he was allowed to take the exam and, to become an engineer. And they said, well, you don't have that ability. So Drake, being who I am, I went to the yard supervisor and I said, I tell you what, give me the opportunity to take the exam. If I fail, I'll quit. If I pass, I become an engineer. So that was too forward. That was too bold. Me, a young Black man, how dare me challenge the system like that? So what they ended up doing was transferring me to the yard out of Oakland. So I ended up moving to Oakland and transferring down there. And that's how I ended up transferring and graduating from the University of San Francisco because my mother couldn't afford to pay for college. So years passed and I moved to Syracuse. Syracuse was very different for me. So I came to Syracuse, entered the School of Management at Syracuse University. When I got here, my very first experience was the financial aid office in the women's building. I went to check on my financial aid and housing. Never will forget this the rest of my life. The very first thing the young woman said to me at the financial aid office, I asked her, I said, listen, I wanted to find a place. I was looking for a certain type of food. And she says, well, I noticed that you're from California. I said, yes. She says, you know, there's two places you can go for this particular dish that I was looking for. You could go on Erie Boulevard, or it's on the south side, right? And she says, you don't really want to go to the south side, you know, because that's not really a good place to be. She says, so if I were you, I would go to the restaurant over on Erie Boulevard. With me being me, which one do you think I went to? So I went to the one on the south side because I knew exactly what that meant, right? So it was actually a microaggression. It wasn't outright, but it was all coded, right? And I never will forget, I called my mom and I said, Mom, I don't know if I'm going to make it in Syracuse. I said, this is a different place and I'm a different kind of person. And it was interesting because my friends at the university ended up being one from Long Island, one from Chicago, one from LA, right? And one from Virginia. So we became very close. We all had similar types of experience. And we said, wow, Syracuse is different, right? Two of us ended up staying, like myself, it ended up being a great place. I was able to navigate. But for an outsider, you know, I don't think people understand the difficulties and the change in the culture, because Syracuse, you have to navigate, you know, the what I call the tribes. You have to navigate the culture. You have to understand what to say, when to say it, like Devin was talking about. You have to bite your tongue when you really don't want to. You have to understand, you have to be that chameleon, right? And you always know when you walk in a room. This is what has always fascinated me. You always know when you walk in a room by looking at the body language, what kind of reception you're going to get. You can tell, because as a Black person, you were brought up to understand nonverbals. You were brought up to understand what is not being said. So, you know, there are good and bad things on both sides, but, you know, Black people and brown people have to always navigate that sort of thing. So that's my experience. I'm ready to answer the question.
Drake, thank you very much. I just have a follow-up question. And the follow-up question is, what steps can districts and clubs take to move the diversity discussion beyond race?
I hate to start my response answering the question with a question. But, you know, when I first saw that, why do we have to move beyond race first? Because, and I say that with all due respect, because when we say race, when we talked about the women's movement, when Gloria Steinem started, right, on the backs of affirmative action, nobody asked, why do we move beyond the women's movement, right? We have to deal with that. I think in order to move beyond that, we have to deal with it first. We have to have those conversations. We have to have remedy, right? I think the first thing before we move beyond is let's have that open and frank discussion. And I know that's challenging and difficult, but if we don't do that, how do we ever move to the next step? How do we ever move to the next level? Now, as a Rotary and as a district, we could begin to have those conversations by putting together these types of things and having discussions about what bothers you. You know, what makes you uncomfortable to deal with race? What makes you uncomfortable to not accept a person for who they are? let me just say this. When I look at the LGBTQIT community, I am always fascinated, all the struggles they went to, but now how, and I'm not saying everybody accepts it, but it's much more accepting, and they made much more progress than Black people made in 200 years. Once that acceptance has taken place, I see socially, it's much more accepted than things and issues that Black people deal with even now. So, we can be inclusive, but what we can do is give audience to everyone, which when Black people have struggled, it has given audience to everyone. Every time something happens like the 15th Amendment, anytime Black people make a move, everybody else benefits, period. Like I say, I say that I'm being humble, but it's true. I think one of the things we can do is read more and look at the issues and things that have held us back as a nation, right? One of the things I think we should do though is include things, that affect everyone, like global warming. Global warming just doesn't affect, one group, it affects all of us, but it's a diversity issue. It's a lack of inclusion, it's a lack of equity issue. So I'm not sure if I answered your question, but that's my response.
No problem. You definitely answered the question, and thank you very much. Denise, we're going to move on to you. And the question I have for you is, can you please share how your social identity has impacted your lived experience in America?
Sure, I'm happy to. I grew up as a person with a disability, and because I think language matters, you'll hear me refer to myself verbally and in writing, both as a person with a disability and as a disabled person. So the difference between the two, person first language being person with a disability versus identity first language, I am a disabled person. For the first 30 years of my life, I never would have considered myself a disabled person. I was very much gung-ho, people first, language matters. You have to put the person first. If you don't put the person first, how are you seeing me? And then I thought, wait a minute. I am disabled and I am proud of that part of my identity. And let's think about the definition of that word. If something is disabled, it's easy to understand what it means. I just need 4 words. It does not work. That's how we tend to use that word. In the traffic reports, you hear that a car is disabled on the side of the road. If the bathroom isn't working in a public bathroom, it's usually marked as disabled or out of order. Well, guess what? I'm disabled, but I work. And most every other person I know that is disabled, they work. They're working their butts off, trying to be independent, living in a system that's not designed for our independence, in an architecture that's not designed for us to be independent. But we are, or we're striving to be. I grew up in a very small town in upstate New York, in Bainbridge. My introduction to Rotary was because my father was a Rotarian. And I first knew Rotary because once a month, when I was in 2nd grade, once a month I couldn't go into the living room when my dad had his friends over for the board of directors meeting, which was in my house at that year because my dad was president. I was a member of Interact. And then when I was 16, I was an exchange student. I was a Rotary Youth Exchange student to Australia, the first student using a wheelchair to successfully complete a Rotary exchange year. I became a Rotarian because I wanted to be of service. It was something that I had done as an interactor along with my community when I was growing up with my dad. And the fact that I was disabled didn't make me think that I couldn't be a Rotarian. It just meant I had to do what everybody else was doing. I am privileged. I grew up at the right time in history if you're going to be disabled. I was the first student to go to my elementary school after the passage of what was then called the Education for All Handicapped Children's Act, now known as the IDEA. And I was starting college in 1991, the year after the Americans with Disabilities Act passed. So I had the benefit of legislation to help me get access. And that privilege, along with the color of my skin, granted me access into places where other people did not have access. And I learned early on that it was my job to try and grant that privilege to other people as best I could. Somebody mentioned before the feeling of, and I think it was Devin, and I'm sorry, I'm gonna not say it right because he said it so much better than I am going to, but the pressure of trying to set the good example for the people that are gonna come after you. I was first a lot of times and knew that I was going to be setting a boundary or a bar that other people were gonna have to try and reach. And I'm proud to be disabled now. I recognize that the rights that I strive for were created by others who fought for civil rights long before me. You know, when disabled people protested in 1973, it was the Black Panthers who brought them food when they were on strike. And I know that my community strives for equality because we are standing on ground that was fought for by other people. And if we're not inclusive in the work that we do to promote a just society for all of us, we are leaving people behind. The work that we do as advocates has to be inclusive because our society, let's face it, I'll never be Black. I'll never understand what it's like to walk down the street with Sim. But Sim, if you want to go out with me, I will hold your hand and I will go with you. I promise. Because I dated a man who was Black, and when we went out together, he swore that everybody was looking at us because of my disability, and I knew it was because of the color of his skin. Because I knew that I never got the looks that I got when I was by myself. But you can join my community at any time.
Thank you.
You are one car accident or one unfortunate fall away from being a part of my community. So we have to be working together on justice issues, or else we're not benefiting anybody. I don't know if that answered your question.
It does definitely answer my question. I do have a follow-up question. How can clubs address a lack of sensitivity to addressing matters of diversity, equity, and inclusion? So lack of buy-in by certain members, lack of understanding, as well as lack of hospitality.
Sure. So I think it's hard for me to be a person who assumes good intent because, you know, like Drake said, I've seen those looks. When you know that somebody is just giving you lip service, but they really don't agree with what you're saying. But I don't think that people are necessarily aware that they're giving off that vibe until sometimes we question ourselves about it. And being open to others means sometimes going above and beyond what you think you might be doing anyway to be a good host. So it means inviting somebody to your meeting, think about what they're going to need to feel comfortable. I've been invited to speak at meetings and I've shown up and seen 2 steps to get into the building. Well, I use a power wheelchair. You may not be able to tell from where you're sitting and where I'm looking right now. But if you're inviting me to your club, I would love to come to your club. But if I'm going to show up physically, maybe you need to think about what I'm going to experience when I get there. Am I going to be able to go up that 1 step that you never thought was an issue? No, I'm not. Are you going to feel comfortable in my club if you're a vegetarian and we are barbecuing hamburgers and hot dogs for that meeting? No. So maybe it's asking more questions before they even come to your club. Maybe it's taking an open and honest look at your club and saying, if I don't look the same as everyone else here, am I going to feel comfortable here? And if the honest answer is no, what do we need to change to make sure we are truly open and inviting to other people? And it's not just letting people in who look different from us. I may not know that Kate experiences the world different from me because on the surface, We may look very similar, but her interactions are going to be different than mine because of the life experiences we bring to the table. Your interactions with the World Sim are going to be different from Drake. They're going to be different from Robin. And we have to understand that even though there may be similarities, we have to treat people with respect that they deserve as individuals as well.
Thank you very, very, very much. The next person, last but definitely not least, we have is Karen. Karen, can you please share how your social identity has impacted your lived experience in the United States?
Thank you, Dr. Covington. Actually, I'm very used to being last because my last name has 2 Z's, but my first name has 2 E's, so it's Kareen. But I just wanted to really thank everyone, the organizers, for allowing me to be part of this important seminar. Given that it's taking place on MLK Day, I want to recognize that regardless of what minority group each of us are here, the panelists or not, do or do not belong, none of us can minimize the impact that systematic racism has had on our daily lives. And I appreciate the opportunity of the seminar to afford me to listen to the experiences which I couldn't possibly know and help take part of dismantling discriminatory behaviors in all of our community. I'm always comforted to see disability included as another dimension of diversity. It demonstrates that diversity is really being considered in its entirety, which is including and celebrating differences and skills and abilities, plus the inclusion of individuals with disabilities in general brings diversity. As Denise noted, there's an estimated over 1 billion people in the world with some form of visible or non-visible disability. It's considered the world's largest minority group. So naturally, there are additional layers of diversity being brought to the table when you include people with disabilities. And with this mention of what we call intersectional identity, let me segue into my personal story. I was born in Athens, Greece, to parents who had fled the civil war in Lebanon that broke out days after their wedding. I'm Armenian by ethnic background. And if you're familiar with the history at all of Armenia and the subject its people had to genocide and still are having, you can appreciate that this part of my identity places me in another minority group with quite opposite numbers as the ones with, being part of the biggest minority group. My family emigrated to America after my now late brother and I were diagnosed with a neuromuscular disability called spinal muscular atrophy. And thanks to the friendships my dad had in his job in Athens, my parents were afforded the opportunity to see an expert at Strong Hospital here in Rochester. And they wanted to get, they were able to visit in the late 70s, and they wanted to get answers as to why their then seemingly healthy 3-year-old hadn't started walking, but had lived past her life expectancy, according to the doctors in Greece. So a few of you have heard me tell the story, but I think it's a good one. And I want to just mention that when my parents were here for the visit, for the diagnosis visit, as we call it, when the doctor relayed or gave the label of what my diagnosis was and tried to introduce what that was to my parents, his first, as he tells it, his first thought was, we have to move to America. There are more television channels in America, so Kareen can watch more television. Obviously, this fact that ignited my parents to move to America through, by the way, great sacrifice, sweat, tears, and enormous support from kind folks here in America was simply the symbolic of the belief that America has more opportunities to offer for a greater quality of life, even for those like me who have lived way past their childhood life expectancy. So I enjoy telling this story for a couple of reasons. First, it's very ironic. Anyone who knows me well knows that I watch less television in a year than the average person does in a day. And also I enjoy telling the story because colleagues, friends, people who haven't even met me, it's a reminder to them that the promise of America has and continues to still offer individuals of all minority groups a greater quality of life. And does this mean that my life experience in America has been a roll in the park? I say roll, not stroll or walk, because language matters, as Denise said. No, that it doesn't mean that it's been a roll in the park. It doesn't mean that I haven't experienced discrimination. There are many examples, and we definitely don't have time for me to relay all of them. But I want to, just highlight a few. Obviously, I would dare to say that almost everyone here knows what structural barriers are. Your average lack of ramps, elevators, sidewalks, push buttons for doors. And yes, there are laws in place to prevent this type of discrimination, but you would be surprised at how many instances fall outside the scope of that legislation. For example, when I attended university in the early 2000s, which was a good decade after the ADA was implemented, the Office of Students with Disabilities in the college was located on the second floor of a building that did not have an elevator. It was a private college. It was not subject to any of the laws. I believe it still isn't subject to this. They were not required to relocate the office. So if I ever wanted to seek the services of the office that is supposed to serve me, I had to call and make other arrangements. Also, to give an example of a issue, Denise did mention about the meeting places. I wanted to give a Rotary specific example of a structural barrier. And, ironically, there's a story that the club that I belong to, that I'm a proud member of, Fairport Rotary, was transitioning meeting places a while back. And they, in the transition, they met in a small restaurant that was in a historic building. And while there was no step, there was a threshold on the bottom of the door that was built up by wood. And it was very, very hard to maneuver in my electric wheelchair. So, my fellow Rotarians would help me out. They tried to push me through the door, and one day doing so chipped the wood on the threshold. And we apologized to the owner, and then apparently, unbeknownst to me later, the owner of the restaurant sent my club a repair bill of about $300 or $400. And my club didn't know where the liability actually lied, and didn't know, didn't want to tell me, I guess, didn't want me to feel bad about it. So they paid the bill. And it was obviously an unforeseen incident with no great resolution. But when I found out about it, it really weighed heavily on my decision whether to attend meetings, not because, of anything anyone did in particular, but I was like, I don't want to be the reason that my club is having to pay, money, like, a significant money, so there are tons of examples like this. A lot of other the more important or more difficult part of ableism for me is that the attitudinal ableism or cultural ableism, as we refer to in the disability community. There's one example is how disabled people of all kinds are depicted in media. They're often, the storylines are written by people who are not disabled and or played by characters who are not disabled, and they're obviously, you know, more often than not, they tend to be angry, difficult characters who only want to be quote unquote cured from their suffering. And I find it a really heavy burden to constantly have to take time and teach people that to disprove this stereotype. And sometimes in the interest of time or just lack of energy, I have allowed people to like stop me in my tracks and pray over me for a cure that, I don't really want. I mean, I'm not saying I don't want to live a quality life, but I feel like I do live a quality life. And so these attitudinal barriers are really the ones I find particularly burdening. And there are so many others. As Denise knows, there's the ones in the medical, like the medical structure, which goes beyond the tentacles of doctors, nurses, clinicals, hospitals. It's the system where that places profits first and foremost over the health and well-being of its citizens, and it's deeply rooted in history, and we're even seeing it now during the COVID pandemic when the topic of eugenics and rationing healthcare have again been brought to the forefront of people's minds, and other place, employment, housing, marriage equality, the precarious nature of the civil rights laws that are there's constantly forces moved to weaken and remove these laws. And I can go on, but I just want to end, however, on a positive note and to tell you that the big takeaway is that I am and will forever be beyond grateful that my father, whether it was true or not, believed that more television stations existed in America. That
Corinne, thank you very much. I do have a follow-up question. How can Rotary clubs identify community partners to support diversity initiatives?
I think there are many ways, and the number one is to use our resources, which is our people. Our people need to be ambassadors, and we are all, professionals, and there are industries that, such as mine, the legal industry, have bar associations that have subcommittees that are also, devoting or creating or enhancing their committees, like diversity and inclusion committees. So to partner up with those in the different industries, to also reach out to the young, because I think our young Interact students and otherwise young, if there are like mentorship programs that we can do, and they are the ones that have been probably more in tune or, more taught about diversity issues, and it comes more naturally to them. So those are two specific ways I thought of, and I think that's it for now.
Well, first and foremost, thank you all very, very, very much for sharing your lived experience, one in this country, as well as steps that we can take as members of Rotary in order to move this charge forward. I am going to take the time to actually piggyback off a lot of the discussion that we've had here tonight to talk about the concept of privilege, because privilege seems to be a word that triggers a lot of people. And one of the things that I always like to communicate when I'm having the opportunity as a Chief Diversity Officer to talk about privilege is the following. For anyone who has the impression that privilege means that you didn't have to work for anything, that you didn't have a hard life, that you grew up swimming in money like Scrooge McDuck, like that you didn't have to, that everything was handed to you. If you are under the impression that that's what privilege means, I would ask you politely to forgive whoever explained it to you that way, because that is the wrong concept of privilege when we're talking about privilege pertaining to diversity, equity, and inclusion. I communicate privilege the following way. What privilege means is there are certain things that other people have to think about that some people never have to think about. Let me repeat that. There are certain things that other people have to think about that some people never have to think about. I'm going to give some stats relevant to myself. This is not to brag, but to give some emphasis relevant to this discussion. So my full name is Sim Jonathan Covington Jr. I am fully aware of the privilege that I have having that name, because if I had a name in this country that was perceived as more ethnic, the opportunities that I have would not be what they are now. That's number one. Number two, I have 3 degrees and 1 certificate from the University at Albany. I have 1 certificate from Empire State College. I have an MBA from SUNY Polytechnic Institute. I have a doctoral degree from Northeastern University. I've worked for SUNY for 16 plus years. I'm the highest ranking person of color at my campus. I have 17 certificates from Ivy League institutions. I have citations from the New York State Assembly as well as the New York State Senate. I've never been arrested. I have no children out of wedlock. I pay my taxes. I'm a community volunteer. I grew up with both of my parents. I'm a philanthropist and I sit on 3 boards in my current geographic location. I can swim, I can cook. I love American classic movies, specifically with Cary Grant. And regardless of everything that I just mentioned, very often in the community, I'm still treated like a common criminal. That's privilege. That's privilege. For people who don't understand privilege, privilege means you have the luxury of not being treated like a common criminal because of the color of your skin. I just mentioned all of my stats. I went to top universities. I don't steal. I don't engage in criminal behavior. But what I want to reiterate, and I have it here, I'm treated like a common criminal, not because of what I did, but because of who I am. That's the conversation that needs to take place, right? Not because of what I did, but because of who I am. That right there is the epitome of when we're talking about privilege. And for people who don't have to think about those things, for people who have the luxury to not have to think about those things. As today is Martin Luther King Day, I do want to very quickly just give the shout out to the following statement. It would be great when we can get to a time in this country, because I still think that we have work to do, where we can judge people, to quote him, to judge people by the content of their character versus the color of their skin. And I think that that is imperative as we continue to lead as Rotarians, as we continue to do community service, as we continue to reflect leadership, and everything's along those lines. So there were a couple of questions that came in from the chat. I was trying to pay attention simultaneously. And some of the questions we have is, let me see, I have it here, give me 1 second. Some of the questions that we have is, what do you say to Rotary members who are hostile to the Black Lives Matter movement? Would anyone like to share?
I'll say something quickly, and I want to make sure there's room for other people to say things. It is easy to disagree with something that you are ignorant about or don't understand. So one of the things that I would say to people is, you're against this thing. What is it that you understand it to be in terms of Black Lives Matter? Okay. There's a lot of people with a lot of misconceptions about what the Black Lives Matter movement is, what it stands for, the variety of activism that it undertakes and things like that. So there's potentially an educational sort of moment there. But to piggyback on what you said, Sim, there's a reality there that needs to be communicated too. The reason that Black Lives Matter exists as a movement is because there are things that Black people and brown people have to think about in terms of their safety and their lives regarding institutional violence that other people do not. The entire movement is pointing to that fact because it has been obscured. So I'll stop there.
My response is along the lines of, give me 1 second. My response is along the lines of that people see life through the lens of their experience, right? So if I'm advocating for something, I'm advocating for something based on my lived experience. It's very important for all Rotary clubs to ask themselves the following question. Linda's going to be very happy right now with what I'm about to say. But it's very important for Rotary clubs to ask themselves the following questions. Whose story are we telling? Who's telling the story? And who's missing from the story? As the chair for the Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion Club here in 7120, one of the things that we're going to be doing is partnering with the United Way. So Linda, I did reach out and they said yes, is partnering with the United Way to do their 21-day racial equity challenge, which was huge in the city of Rochester, right? So making sure that we can have real conversations. I think it's also important that when we're having conversations around diversity, equity, and inclusion, or at least when I do, we need to talk about the real history of this country, and the real history of this country includes colonization, Jim Crow, slavery, right? We need to have real conversations in order to move the dial forward. And I think you need to be able to do it most effectively. One of the things that I've been able to do in this geographic area is that I'm conducting implicit bias training for a lot of the local law enforcement agencies. But let me make this crystal clear. I'm doing it the right way. And you have to be able to engage people in this conversation the right way. The wrong way is with the intention of making everybody feel guilty and responsible for all of the injustice that has taken place in this country, because they're going to get defensive and it's not going to sink in. The right way is creating space where we can talk about the lived experience of others, as well as how people may be currently intentionally or unintentionally contributing to oppression that's continuing to take place. And that's how you have that conversation the right way. Is there anybody else who would like to share before I get to the next question? Okay, the next question we have is, it was a question to the individuals who are a part of this meeting tonight who identify as Black. What persuaded you to join Rotary? I'll start with myself. I was in the Utica, New York area. I had a professional colleague who asked me to go with him to a Rotary meeting. And I liked what I saw. So I started to ask questions. It was an opportunity for me to learn. And by default of the values embedded in Rotary, which I subscribe to, it was a go. So that's what really motivated me to participate in Rotary. Since coming to the Canandaigua Rotary Club, I've also had the opportunity to engage in service. They have a camp in the area. I had the opportunity to go help them clean up the camp. The Canandaigua Rotary Club has something called a bike rodeo. I participated in that. We help people move wood, like chop wood and like firewood, excuse me. I helped them with that and other things. I'm not always involved with Canandaigua Rotary Club as I used to be because I'm extremely busy, but regardless, I do want to reiterate when there was opportunities presented for me to serve, they welcomed me the same way they welcomed everyone else, and that is very important. Something that I want to make sure that I got, all right, something that Drake brought up, what I also would like to reiterate is, people may be under the false impression that someone has to tell you that they have a problem for you in order for you to pick up on it. That is incorrect. I don't have to tell you that I don't like you in order for you to feel it. My term for it is intangible hostility, right? And in regards to that intangible hostility, the issue becomes it allows the perpetrator to say what? But I didn't do anything, right? Mind you, they're fully aware of the negative energy that they're emitting and putting off, and it's intentional, right? So I think that within these clubs, we also need to talk about, as we're welcoming diversity, equity, inclusion, what stage are we setting? How are we exhibiting welcome within this organization? Because that's also important. For anyone else who identifies as Black, once again, the question specifically to Black Rotarians, what persuaded you to join Rotary? And then I have one more question after that.
Okay, I'll go next.
Please.
What persuaded me to join the Rotary was actually the persistence of one member, Bernie, and I also decided I believed in the philosophy and the mission of the Rotary. I want to join organizations that are action oriented and who, that don't do a whole lot of talking, but, get things done. And I saw what they were doing in Africa in terms of trying to eliminate polio. I thought that was fantastic. And also, personally, I decided to join to get out of my comfort zone, to put myself in a situation where I could learn from others and be a part of something where I could grow. I always want to grow. And I felt that there was a lot of people in the organization or in that particular club that had experiences that I could learn from.
Thank you very much. Is there anyone else?
Have you heard?
There. Drake and I are of the same club, so similar experiences, but I joined maybe a year earlier. For me, besides Bernie's incredible sales savvy, I would say that the members themselves were so welcoming and open and loving from the very start. I mean, from Shelly to Alicia to Jonathan to some members who aren't even members anymore. From the start, it was the feeling that you rarely get as a young African and male in a predominantly white group, which was, I don't want to say they didn't see my color, but my color didn't matter. Every time I came, there was always so much love and so much interest in who I was. It was very easy, although there were so many differences culturally, age-wise, and just generally speaking. It was very easy for me to open up and call this group, one of mine. So hats off to my club, and I hope that we can help other clubs move in a similar way.
And I'll just say quickly also, Sam, and I know we are over time, but I don't, I have nothing else to do. COVID has changed my life. So I'm just, I've got time, people got time. So it was Vern Tryon from the Oswego Club. He invited me to come, and like similar to Drake's store, I has come and other folks, and they asked me to come into a meeting and I gave a presentation, and they invited me to join. And one of the reasons, and similar to Drake, I was in a limited sphere of activity surrounding SUNY Oswego. And most of my reach into the community was connected to the college. And I was not reaching into the community or engaging in the community with people who were not directly employed by, or spouses of people who are employed by, the college. And so Rotary gave me an opportunity to be in the community in a different way, which is something I really want to do. So it's been good so far. I will say this, the challenge is change. The Oswego Rotary Club has a lot of traditions, it's a very traditional club, and meeting people where they are at, which a bunch of people have said, right? I think Devin may have said it as well, is going to be the place where at least my Rotary Club is going to have to do some work. And I'll give you a very quick example. I was working in Kentucky for a small college there before I came back to SUNY Oswego and back to New York State. And, a person comes up to me and says, hey, there's all these great things going on in town. And I said, hey, that's wonderful. I'm just new to town. Please tell me about them. We have Brass Band Festival. I was like, okay, that's great. But that doesn't, here's something. That doesn't mean anything to me. That's great. And it's wonderful that you like brass bands and everything else. That's not meeting needs that I have. Here are some things that I need. Where can I find those? And so aligning the work of the club and the way that it outreaches to people in ways that are going to resonate and be meaningful to them is going to be one of the ways in which, at least particularly for my club, we are going to have to evolve.
All right, so here's the last question. I'll do the last two questions. One of the questions that we had was also the following. Give me 1 second because I have to pull it up. Give me 1 second, I apologize. The question we have is, how can we call out hostility when we see it in the right way? So one of the ways that I call out hostility when I see it in the right way is by asking, I practice what's called inquiry-based leadership. So when I see something, I'll ask more questions, right? So the questions that I ask is, why are you uncomfortable? And how do you handle your discomfort? So if somebody makes an off-color remark, my response is, why does that make you uncomfortable? Right? Because what they expect you to do is just accept whatever they put out there on the surface level, right? So very quickly before I get to the last questions for the night, when it comes to bias that people have, one of the things that Rodman mentioned is that we're not born this way, and that is 100% correct. People get messages from three primary sources, We get messages from our family of origin. We get messages from the media, whatever media influence dictates that what we look at. And last but not least, we get messages from our social circle. Family of origin, from childhood and beyond, we knew who we could or could not bring home, hang out with, and that was either expressed explicitly, we don't hang with those kind, or implicitly, you're really going out with that person, right? Our media circles, whatever our media influence is, and our social circles as well. All right, the last question that we have for tonight, because I want to be cognizant of time, is the following. You have all said that Rotary needs to be committed to diversity, equity, and inclusion, but how do we move from sharing our commitment in a philosophical sense to moving forward in actions to improve our club? One of the things that we're going to be doing in 7120 is actually moving from theory to practice. So the first thing that we're going to be doing for moving to theory to practice is engaging in a 21-day challenge through the United Way of Rochester. So that's number one. In addition to that, once we get through that, because I'm going to be chairing, I'm going to be working with our committee in regards to us forming formal definitions in regards to so that we can have shared language. What do we mean by diversity, equity, inclusion? Once we have that in place, we can then start having conversations around creating strategic goals in order to move the charge forward. A perfect example in regards to strategic goals to move the charge forward, if we're looking to diversify membership, is, especially in Canandaigua, New York, which is not necessarily that diverse, how can we partner with organizations that already have diversity embedded? So here at FLCC, we have an Alana student organization, right? Teach them about Rotary. Maybe we can create a Rotaract club here. We have a PRISM student organization. Teach them about Rotary. So there are so many rich opportunities where you can foster understanding, right, in order to move the dial forward in a genuine way. But once again, in regards to action items, you need to have a variety of things. One, you need to have goals that's aligned with your organization's strategic plan. That's number one. Two, you need to have action items for those goals. Three, you need to have lead agents. Four, you need to have metrics in regards to we're looking to increase by this % by this time. Even though I'm using the higher education language, long story short, what you need to create is what's called SMART goals, right? You need SMART goals. You need SMART goals. You need SMART goals. Specific, measurable, attainable, realistic, and time bound, right? So you need to have SMART goals relevant to what you're looking to do for your club and what time frame. And last but not least, before I give it off to the other panelists, is that when you're creating SMART goals, this is very important. Assessment is not evaluation. Let me repeat that. Assessment is not evaluation. So at the end of whatever the SMART goals is, if you didn't reach your goal, that doesn't mean that you suck as a club. What that does mean is, okay, this is what we did good. How can we change it to become better in the future? That's what it means. All right, I'll give it to you again, Rodman, and then we'll go to some other people. Once again, we have all said that Rotary needs to be committed. How do we move from sharing our commitment in a philosophical sense to moving forward in actions to improve the club?
Well, Sim, you said just about everything, man. I just, I'll say some things very, very, very quickly. I want to make sure I be respectful of people's time, but also make sure that there's time for the other panelists. We have to come down to an essential truth that will motivate action. The essential truth that diversity, equity, and inclusion are hardwired into the four-way test. And if people fully understand what that means, and that the four-way test is not just something you do at meetings, it's something else, but these are supposed to be guiding principles of the club, guiding principles of our actions as Rotarians, and that diversity, equity, and inclusion are wired into them, you can then, from those shared principles, come up with the SMART goals and things like that. It's not just the work of a DEI committee. It's not just the work of the other things like this. It is shared work of the entire club to do. Last thing I'll say is this: trying to be a healthier person during the pandemic, because my heart desires exercise, but my stomach desires apple pie. Okay, and so I will not become a healthy person if I do exercise or get on the treadmill once a month. What you can do, and I can become a healthy person or healthier, lose weight by exercising every single day. We have weekly Rotary Club meetings. These discussions, elements of this, needs to be part of weekly club meetings. And you walk that road together as a club. Explore identity, understand privilege, right? Sim gave a great definition from it. There's tons of literature on stuff like that. You got Dr. Covington here. Invite him to your club. Have him talk about privilege for one of your meetings. You've got other people on the line, okay? Make a resource list. You've got resources internal to Rotary that you can call on, And you don't even have to buy us lunch. I'll leave it at that.
Kudos. Are there any other panelists who would like to also share at this time?
Yes, if you don't mind, I'll just give my 2 cents. So I think too, right, we have to, in conversation, we have to have the dialogue, but we have to as well be curious versus judgmental on both sides, right? If we want a dialogue, we have to be open to hear what the other person's vision or version is, no matter how we feel, right? We have to be able to do that. And then we have to have courageous conversations. We have to be ready to and willing to